My name is Jonathan, and I'm just an ordinary guy with a love for adventure and the open road. I've always enjoyed the sense of freedom that comes with driving. Just me, my car, and the endless possibilities of where I could go. Over the years, I've taken countless road trips, both alone and with friends, but nothing has ever come close to the experience I had last summer. It was a journey that started like any other, but quickly turned into something I still can't fully explain. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. Growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else, I learned to be self-reliant and level-headed. My parents were practical people, and they taught me to face challenges head-on, to trust my instincts, and to never back down from a problem. That mentality served me well through school, and later in my career as an IT specialist. I'm the guy people call when they have a problem they can't solve, a computer that won't boot up, a system that crashes without warning. I'm used to being the one who figures things out, who finds logical explanations for strange occurrences. But what happened on that road trip was different. It was something beyond logic, beyond anything I could have prepared for. And it's something I'll never forget. It all started on a Friday afternoon in late July. I had taken a week off work, deciding to hit the road and explore some of the lesser-known parts of the state. I had no real destination in mind, just a desire to get away, to clear my head, and to enjoy some solitude. I packed a bag, filled up the tank in my old Honda Civic, and set out with nothing but a map and a vague plan to head north. The first few days were uneventful. I drove through small towns and open countryside, stopping occasionally to take pictures or grab a bite to eat at a roadside diner. It was exactly what I had hoped for, a peaceful escape from the routine of everyday life. On the fourth day, I found myself on a long, winding road that cut through a dense forest. The trees on either side of the road were tall and thick, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was the kind of road you only find in the middle of nowhere, where there's no cell service and the nearest town is miles away. I was enjoying the drive, the solitude, the quiet hum of the engine as it carried me deeper into the woods. The road was empty, and I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour. It was just me and the open road, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. That's when I first noticed the car. It appeared out of nowhere, suddenly visible in my rearview mirror. It was an old, beat-up sedan, dark blue, almost black, with tinted windows that made it impossible to see inside. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just another traveler, someone else who had decided to take the road less traveled. But there was something about the car that made me uneasy, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The car stayed behind me, following at a distance that was just close enough to be noticeable, but not so close that it felt like tailgating. I kept an eye on it in the mirror, expecting it to pass me or take an exit, but it didn't. It just stayed there, following me through the twists and turns of the road. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, it wasn't unusual to see other cars on the road, even in a place as remote as this. But as the miles passed, the unease in my gut grew stronger. There was something off about that car, something that made my skin crawl. The longer the car followed me, the more unnerving its presence became. It maintained a constant distance, never speeding up or slowing down, just keeping pace with me as if it were tethered to my bumper by an invisible rope. It was almost as if the driver was matching my every move, deliberately staying just far enough back to avoid suspicion, but close enough to ensure I couldn't forget it was there. I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror more often than I should have. My attention divided between the road ahead and the shadowy figure that loomed behind me. The car's headlights were off, even though the sun was beginning to dip below the treetops, casting long shadows across the road. It was as if the driver didn't want to be seen, didn't want to reveal anything about who or what was inside that car. The road wound through the forest, the trees growing denser and darker as the sun continued its slow descent. I considered pulling over to let the car pass, but something in my gut told me not to. The idea of stopping on that deserted road, with that car right behind me, filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. So I kept driving, my grip on the steering wheel tightening as the unease gnawed at me. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the road opened up into a straight stretch, a rare break in the otherwise twisting path. I pressed down on the accelerator, hoping to put some distance between me and the car. But no matter how fast I went, the car maintained its distance, never falling behind, never pulling ahead. It was as if it was toying with me, playing some sick game that only it knew the rules to. I tried to shake the car by taking random turns, hoping to lose it in the labyrinth of back roads that crisscrossed the forest. But every time I thought I had managed to ditch it, it would reappear in my mirror, as if it knew exactly where I was going, as if it could read my mind. The sky continued to darken, the last rays of sunlight disappearing behind the trees. The road grew more treacherous, the shadows deeper, the night closing in around me like a shroud. I flicked on my headlights, illuminating the narrow strip of asphalt in front of me, but the car behind me remained dark, its headlights off, its presence a constant, looming threat. As the night descended in full, the darkness seemed to come alive around me. The trees, once just a backdrop to my journey, now appeared like towering sentinels, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching out for me. The road seemed narrower, the twists sharper, and the shadows deeper. It felt like I was driving through a tunnel with no end in sight, the only sound the steady hum of my engine and the rhythmic thud of my heart. But no sound was as unnerving as the one that wasn't there, the absence of any sign that the mysterious car was preparing to pass or turn off. It was as if the driver had no destination, no purpose other than to follow me, to keep me in sight. The fact that they hadn't turned on their headlights was particularly disturbing. It wasn't just dangerous, it was as though they wanted to remain hidden, to avoid drawing attention to themselves. The longer it went on, the more my mind raced with questions. Who was driving that car? Why were they following me? Was this some kind of sick joke or something far more sinister? The scenarios played out in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Maybe it was a carjacker waiting for the right moment to strike, or maybe it was something worse, something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had lost signal hours ago when I first entered the forest. The realization that I was completely cut off from the outside world, with no way to contact anyone, only added to my growing sense of fear. I began to feel a sense of panic rising in my chest, a cold, creeping dread that made it hard to breathe. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away, to escape from this nightmare. But no matter how hard I tried to think of a way out, I kept coming back to the same terrifying conclusion. I was trapped on a dark, isolated road with a car that seemed determined to follow me to the ends of the earth. The road ahead forked suddenly, and without thinking I veered left, hoping that the sudden change in direction would throw off my pursuer. For a moment I dared to hope that I had lost them, that I was finally free of that ominous presence. But then, in the dim glow of my rearview mirror, I saw it, those faint, unmistakable outlines of the car's silhouette. It had followed me, as relentless and silent as before. My pulse quickened, my heart pounding in my chest as the realization hit me. Whoever was driving that car wasn't just following me by chance. They were hunting me. My mind raced with possibilities. I needed a plan, some way to confront this thing, whatever it was, or to find a way to escape. I knew I couldn't keep driving forever. My gas tank was getting low, and the further I went into the forest, the more lost I became. I had to do something before it was too late. Then I spotted it, a small, dilapidated gas station just off the side of the road. Its neon sign flickered weakly in the darkness, the light barely penetrating the thick fog that had begun to settle over the area. It looked abandoned, but it was my only hope. I made a split-second decision and pulled into the gas station, my tires screeching on the gravel as I came to a stop. I turned off the engine and waited, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I stared at the road behind me. For a moment, everything was silent. The car wasn't there. I almost dared to believe that I had finally lost it, that the nightmare was over. But then, slowly, it emerged from the darkness. The same beat-up sedan, its dark silhouette barely visible through the thickening fog. It rolled to a stop at the entrance of the gas station, its engine idling, its headlights still off. The only light came from the weak glow of the gas station's sign, casting eerie shadows across the empty lot. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. Whoever was in that car wasn't going away. They were here with me, waiting, but for what? I knew I couldn't stay in the car. If I was going to confront this, I needed to do it now while I still had the element of surprise. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. Then, with one final glance at the rearview mirror, I pushed open the door and stepped out into the night. The air was cold, biting into my skin as I walked toward the gas station. The crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound, the silence otherwise deafening. I kept my eyes on the sedan, watching for any sign of movement, any hint of who or what might be inside. As I approached the door of the gas station, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. My instincts were screaming at me to turn back, to get in my car and drive as fast as I could. But I couldn't leave now, not when I was so close to finding out the truth. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking as I pulled it open. The door creaked on its hinges, the sound echoing in the empty space as I stepped inside. The interior of the gas station was as dilapidated as the outside. The shelves were covered in dust, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. There was no sign of anyone, no cashier, no customers. Just silence. But then, in the far corner of the room, I saw it, a faint glow, like the light of a small candle. I moved closer, my footsteps slow and deliberate, my heart pounding in my chest. The light flickered as I approached, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Then I saw it, the source of the light. It was a small, old-fashioned lantern, sitting on the floor next to an overturned chair. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. Next to the lantern, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. A man slumped against the wall, his face obscured by the darkness. His clothes were torn and dirty, his skin pale and cold. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at the figure. For a moment I thought he was dead, but then I saw his chest rise and fall, slowly, laboriously, as if he were barely clinging to life. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. But something kept me rooted to the spot, some morbid curiosity or instinct that I couldn't explain. "Are you okay?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't respond. He didn't even move. It was as if he couldn't hear me, as if he were lost in some dark, unreachable place. I took a step closer, my hand reaching out to touch his shoulder. But before I could make contact, something stopped me. A sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from outside. The sound of a car door opening. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat as I realized what it meant. The driver of the sedan, the one who had been following me, had finally decided to make their move. I backed away from the man, my eyes darting to the door. I had to get out of there. But before I could make a move, I heard another sound, a low, guttural moan, coming from the man on the floor. I turned back to him, and that's when I saw his face for the first time. His eyes were wide open, staring straight at me, filled with a terror so profound that it sent a chill down my spine. His mouth moved, forming words that I couldn't hear, his hand reaching out as if to grab me. But before he could, the door to the gas station slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the room was plunged into darkness. For a moment I was paralyzed, trapped in the dark, the silence so complete that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Had the driver entered the gas station? Were they in the room with me, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike? And what about the man on the floor? Was he a victim, or something else entirely? Something I couldn't even begin to understand? I forced myself to move, to take a step toward the door. My hand fumbled in the darkness, searching for the doorknob. I had to get out, had to escape before it was too late. But before I could find the door, I felt something cold and clammy brush against my arm, a hand reaching out from the darkness. I jerked away, my heart pounding, but the hand tightened its grip, pulling me back, dragging me toward the source of the moan. No, I gasped, struggling to free myself. Let go. But the hand only tightened, the grip unrelenting, pulling me closer to the man in the corner. I could feel his breath on my skin, could hear the low, guttural moan rising from his throat. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the grip loosened and I was free. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The room was still dark, the silence oppressive, but the feeling of dread of being hunted was stronger than ever. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out, had to find a way to escape the nightmare that I had stumbled into. I found the doorknob and twisted it, pushing the door open with a strength I didn't know I had. I stumbled outside, into the cold, damp night, the fog thick around me, the darkness closing in. The sedan was still there, parked at the entrance to the gas station, its driver's side door open. But there was no sign of the driver, no sign of the person who had been following me. I ran to my car, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I had to get out of there, had to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of the gas station, gravel flying as I tore down the road. I didn't look back, didn't check to see if the sedan was following me. I just drove as fast as I could, until the forest gave way to open fields, until the fog lifted and the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. It wasn't until I was miles away, the gas station and the sedan nothing but a distant memory, that I finally allowed myself to slow down. My hands were still shaking, my mind racing with the events of the night. What had happened back there? Who was the man in the gas station? And who or what had been driving that sedan? I didn't have any answers, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. All I knew was that I had escaped, that I was safe, at least for now. But the memory of that night stayed with me, haunting my thoughts, my dreams. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that the darkness I had encountered on that lonely road wasn't done with me yet. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, driving down a dark, empty road, I catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a faint, shadowy figure, just out of sight, following me. And I wonder if I'll ever truly escape, or if that mysterious car, and the terror it brought with it, will follow me for the rest of my life. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a road trip that my friends and I had been planning for months. The idea was simple. 4 of us, piled into my old reliable SUV, hitting the open road for a week of freedom. No strict itinerary, no reservations, just a loose plan to explore the back roads of the Midwest and see where the journey took us. It was late summer, that time of year when the days are still long and the nights carry a hint of the coming fall. We were all looking forward to the break from our regular lives, a chance to unwind and reconnect with each other away from the stress and noise of the city. I had known these guys for years. We met in college and had stayed close ever since, despite the fact that our lives had taken us in different directions. There was Bruce, the oldest of the group and the unofficial leader of our little band of misfits. He was the one who had first suggested the trip, and it didn't take much convincing to get the rest of us on board. Then there was Dave, the joker of the group, always ready with a quick remark or a joke to lighten the mood. And finally there was Tom, the quiet, thoughtful one, whose calm demeanor balanced out Bruce's enthusiasm and Dave's antics. As for me, I'm Dylan, the one who always ended up being the voice of reason when things got out of hand. I had been looking forward to this trip as much as anyone, eager to leave behind the stress of my job and the routine of everyday life. The idea of spending a week on the road with my closest friends, with nothing but the open highway ahead of us, seemed like the perfect escape. We set out early on a Saturday morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. The air was cool and crisp, the sky a brilliant shade of blue. The SUV was packed with everything we needed for the trip: camping gear, a cooler full of drinks, and enough snacks to last us a week. We had a few destinations in mind, small towns and scenic spots we had marked on the map, but for the most part, we planned to just go where the road took us. The first couple of days were exactly what we had hoped for. We drove through endless stretches of farmland, rolling hills and dense forests, stopping whenever something caught our interest. We visited quirky roadside attractions, camped under the stars, and spent our nights around a campfire, talking and laughing like we hadn't in years. It was everything we had wanted: an adventure, a chance to reconnect, and a break from the routine of our lives. But then, on the 3rd day of our trip, everything changed. It started with a wrong turn, a simple mistake that led us down a road we should never have taken. And from that moment on, our road trip became something else entirely, a journey into a nightmare that none of us could have imagined. We were all looking for something on this trip. For Bruce, it was a chance to take a break from the pressures of his job. He was a lawyer, always juggling multiple cases and working late into the night. The stress was starting to take its toll, and this road trip was his way of hitting the reset button. Bruce was the kind of guy who thrived on challenges, but even he needed a break sometimes. Dave, on the other hand, was in a completely different place. He worked in advertising, a job that he enjoyed but didn't exactly love. He was the kind of guy who was always restless, always looking for the next big thing. This trip was supposed to be a chance for him to blow off some steam, to escape the monotony of his life, and maybe figure out what he wanted to do next. Tom was the quietest of the group, but that didn't mean he wasn't dealing with his own struggles. He had just gone through a tough breakup, the end of a relationship that had lasted for nearly 5 years. It had hit him hard, and this trip was supposed to be a way for him to get his mind off things, to spend time with his friends and start to heal. And then there was me. I was the one who had everything planned out: the career, the relationship, the future. I had been with my girlfriend Sarah for almost 2 years, and we had just moved in together. I had a stable job as a graphic designer, a good group of friends, and a life that, on the surface, seemed pretty perfect. But deep down, I was starting to feel trapped. The routine of my life, the predictability of it all, was beginning to weigh on me. This road trip was supposed to be my chance to break free, to remind myself that there was more to life than work and responsibility. We had all been friends since college, and over the years we had grown closer than brothers. We had been through everything together, the good times, the bad times, the moments of triumph, and the moments of triumph, and the moments of heartbreak. We knew each other better than anyone else, and we had always been there for each other, no matter what. So when Bruce suggested the road trip, we all jumped at the chance. It was a chance to get away, to leave behind our problems and responsibilities, and to spend time with the people who meant the most to us. We didn't have any specific destination in mind. We just wanted to hit the road, see where it took us, and enjoy the ride. For the first couple of days, everything went according to plan. We drove through small towns, stopped at roadside diners, and took in the sights and sounds of the open road. We laughed, we joked, and we talked about everything and nothing. It was exactly what we had needed, a break from the real world, a chance to be carefree again. But as the third day of our trip dawned, something changed. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, with dark clouds rolling in and the wind picking up. We had planned to spend the day exploring a small town we had read about, but when we arrived, we found it deserted. The streets were empty, the buildings abandoned, and there was an eerie silence that hung over everything. It was unsettling, to say the least, and we quickly decided to move on. That's when we made the wrong turn. We were driving along a narrow, winding road that cut through a dense forest, the trees towering over us on either side. The GPS had led us there, assuring us that it was a shortcut that would take us to the main highway. But as we drove deeper into the forest, the road became rougher, the trees closer, and the sense of unease that had been growing since we left the deserted town intensified. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Tom asked from the back seat, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "This is what the GPS says," Bruce replied, his eyes glued to the road ahead. "We just need to keep going, and we'll hit the highway soon." But as we continued to drive, the road became narrower and more overgrown. The trees pressed in on us, their branches scratching against the sides of the SUV like skeletal fingers. The sky had darkened, the clouds thick and heavy, threatening rain at any moment. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested, my unease growing with each passing mile. "This doesn't feel right." Bruce hesitated, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He was always the one who took charge, who made the decisions, but even he seemed to be having second thoughts. "We've come this far," Dave said, trying to sound confident, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Let's just see where this road leads." We pressed on, the road growing rougher with each turn. The GPS signal had weakened, and then, without warning, it cut out entirely, leaving us with no way to navigate. The realization that we were lost, completely and utterly lost, hit us all at once. Panic began to set in. We were miles from the nearest town, in the middle of a forest that seemed to go on forever. The sun was beginning to set, and the thought of being stuck out here in the dark was terrifying. But there was no going back. The road was too narrow to turn around, and there were no signs, no landmarks to guide us. We were trapped, caught in a maze of trees and shadows, with no way out. Just when it seemed like we had reached the end of the road, we saw it, a small clearing up ahead, with a cluster of old, run-down buildings. Relief washed over us at the sight of them, though it was tinged with a sense of dread. There was something off about the place, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "We should stop here and ask for directions," Bruce said, though his voice lacked the confidence it usually held. We had no other choice. The road had led us here, and it seemed like our only option. We pulled into the clearing, the tires crunching on the gravel as we came to a stop. The buildings looked like they had been abandoned for years, their windows dark and empty, their paint peeling and faded. There was no sign of life, no sign that anyone had been here in a long time. But as we stepped out of the SUV, we heard it, a faint, distant sound, like the creaking of a door or the rustling of leaves. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. "Let's make this quick," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. We approached the nearest building, a small, weathered house with a sagging porch. The door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. Bruce knocked, the sound echoing in the silence. For a moment, nothing happened. We stood there, waiting, our breath held, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. Then, the door creaked open, revealing a figure standing in the shadows. The figure was a man, his features obscured by the darkness inside the house. He stood there, silent and still, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. There was something wrong about him, something that set off every alarm bell in my mind. "Hi," Bruce began, his voice faltering as he took a step back. "We're lost. We were wondering if you could give us directions back to the main highway." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at us with eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unblinking, like a predator sizing up its prey. A feeling of dread washed over me, and I wanted nothing more than to turn around and get back in the car. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to run as far away from this place as possible. But before I could say anything, the man finally spoke. "Not many people come this way," he said, his voice low and gravelly. There was something unsettling about the way he spoke, as if he were choosing his words carefully, hiding something just beneath the surface. "We didn't mean to," Bruce said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We just took a wrong turn." The man stepped out of the shadows, and I finally got a good look at him. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that were almost unnaturally dark. His clothes were old and tattered, as if they hadn't been washed in years. There was something off about his appearance, something that made him seem out of place, like he didn't belong in this world. "There's no highway around here," the man said, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Not for miles." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. We were more lost than we had thought, stranded in a place that seemed to be cut off from the rest of the world. "Is there any way to get back?" Tom asked, his voice trembling slightly. The man tilted his head, as if considering the question. "There's a road that leads out of here," he said slowly, "but it's not easy to find, and it's not a road that many people take." The way he said it, with that strange, almost mocking tone, sent a chill down my spine. "We'll take our chances," Dave said, his usual bravado faltering as he glanced around nervously. The man smiled again, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Suit yourself," he said, stepping back into the shadows. "But be careful. There are things in these woods that you don't want to meet." With that, he closed the door, leaving us standing there, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. We didn't waste any time getting back to the SUV. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now threatened to boil over, and I could see it in the faces of my friends as we hurried back to the car. Bruce didn't say a word as he started the engine, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. As we pulled out of the clearing and back onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the man's eyes were still on us, following us as we drove away. The trees closed in around us once more, the darkness growing thicker, the road more treacherous with each passing mile. We didn't talk much as we drove. The tension in the car was palpable, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own fears. The man's words echoed in my mind, his warning about the things in the woods playing over and over like a broken record. After what felt like hours, the road finally began to widen, the trees giving way to open fields. We breathed a collective sigh of relief as we saw the faint outline of a town in the distance, the lights twinkling like beacons of hope. But as we got closer, the relief turned to confusion. The town was unlike anything we had ever seen. The buildings were old and crumbling, their windows dark and empty. There were no people, no cars, no signs of life at all. It was as if the town had been abandoned for years, left to decay in the middle of nowhere. "This isn't right," Bruce said, his voice barely above a whisper. We drove slowly through the empty streets, the sense of unease growing with each passing moment. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something that made my skin crawl. It was as if we had stepped into a ghost town, a place that had been forgotten by time. And then we saw them, the figures, standing in the shadows watching us. They were barely visible, just dark shapes lurking at the edges of the street. But I could feel their eyes on us, could feel their presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. "Keep driving," Tom said, his voice trembling with fear. Bruce didn't need to be told twice. He stepped on the gas, the SUV lurching forward as we sped out of the town and back onto the open road. The figures didn't follow, but the sense of dread lingered, the memory of their watching eyes burned into my mind. The road ahead was long and straight, stretching out into the darkness like a never-ending ribbon of asphalt. The sky had turned an inky black, with no moon or stars to light our way. The headlights of the SUV cut through the darkness, but they seemed weak, almost ineffective against the overwhelming night. We were all on edge, the fear that had been growing since we first took that wrong turn now reaching a fever pitch. No one spoke, the silence in the car thick and heavy, as if we were all too afraid to break it. But then, out of nowhere, the road began to change. It twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, looping back on itself, leading us in circles. The trees that lined the road seemed to shift and move, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, clawing at the car as we passed. "What the hell is going on?" Dave shouted, his voice breaking the silence. "I don't know," Bruce replied, his voice tense with fear. "I'm just trying to follow the road, but it's like it's changing, like it's leading us somewhere." The fear in his voice was mirrored in my own heart. It was as if the road itself had come alive, twisting and turning us around, leading us deeper into the darkness, deeper into the nightmare. And then, just when it seemed like we were trapped, we saw it, a light in the distance, flickering and weak, but unmistakable. "There," Tom shouted, pointing toward the light. "Head for that light." Bruce didn't hesitate. He floored the gas, the SUV speeding toward the light with a desperation that we all felt. The road seemed to fight against us, throwing obstacles in our path, but we pressed on, our eyes locked on that single point of light. As we got closer, the light grew brighter, revealing itself to be a small, run-down liquor store, sitting alone in the middle of the woods. It was an odd sight, out of place in the thick forest, but at that moment it was a beacon of hope. We pulled into the liquor store, the tires screeching on the gravel as we came to a stop. The building was old and decrepit, with peeling paint and broken windows. The only light came from a single bulb hanging above the door, flickering like it was on its last leg. "Do you think someone's inside?" Dave asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Only one way to find out," Bruce replied, though he didn't sound too confident. We got out of the car, the cold night air biting at our skin as we approached the liquor store. The door was slightly ajar, just like the one at the house where we had encountered the strange man. It creaked as we pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. The inside of the liquor store was just as run down as the outside. The shelves were covered in dust, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. There was no sign of anyone, just silence. "This is too weird," Tom said, his voice trembling. But before we could decide what to do next, we heard it, a sound from the back of the liquor store, faint but unmistakable. It was a low, growling moan like someone in pain, or something far worse. "Did you hear that?" Dave asked, his eyes wide with fear. We all nodded, too terrified to speak. The sound came again, louder this time, and I felt my blood run cold. There was something in the back of the liquor store, something that we couldn't see, but could feel, a presence dark and malevolent, watching us, waiting for us to make a move. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But before we could turn back, the door to the liquor store slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. The light above flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. Panic set in. We fumbled for our phones, for anything that could provide light, but the darkness was too thick, too oppressive. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, and with it came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer with each passing second. "Who's there?" Bruce shouted, his voice echoing in the dark. But there was no answer, just the sound of those footsteps, drawing nearer and nearer, until they seemed to be right on top of us. And then out of the darkness, a voice, a low, raspy whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was followed by a loud crash, like something heavy being thrown to the ground. I felt a hand grab my arm, and I nearly screamed, but it was Bruce, pulling me toward the back of the liquor store. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, his voice filled with panic. We ran blindly through the darkness, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. The sounds of pursuit were close behind, the footsteps gaining on us, the voice loud and insistent. But we didn't stop. We pushed through a door at the back of the liquor store, stumbling into what looked like a storage room. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline, and in the faint light filtering through a small window, we could see old, rusted tools and cans of fuel stacked haphazardly on the shelves. "There," Bruce shouted, pointing to a small, narrow door at the far end of the room. We didn't hesitate. We ran for the door, throwing it open and tumbling out into the cold night air. We were behind the liquor store now, the dense forest pressing in on us from all sides. But there was no time to catch our breath. The footsteps were still following us, the presence still closing in, relentless in its pursuit. "This way," Tom shouted, leading us toward a narrow path that wound through the trees. We followed him, our feet pounding on the dirt path as we ran deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around us, their branches clawing at our clothes, their roots threatening to trip us at every step. The path was barely visible, a thin ribbon of dirt winding through the thick undergrowth, but it was our only chance of escape. The presence was still behind us, the footsteps growing louder, closer. I could hear its breath now, ragged and labored, as if it was exerting itself to catch up with us. The voice came, loud and insistent. "You can't run from me." But we kept running, our fear driving us forward. The path twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the forest, but we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. The presence was right behind us, its cold breath on the back of our necks, its whispers filling our ears. And then, just when it seemed like we were trapped, we saw it. The road was just ahead, cutting through the forest like a lifeline. "There," Bruce shouted, his voice filled with hope. We burst out of the trees and onto the road, our feet pounding on the asphalt as we sprinted toward the SUV. The car was still where we had left it, the doors open, the engine still running. We didn't waste any time. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut behind us. Bruce floored the gas, the tires screeching as we sped down the road, away from the liquor store, away from the presence that had been chasing us. But even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that the presence was still with us, lurking around the next bend, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. It's been weeks since we returned from that road trip, but I can't stop thinking about what happened. We've all tried to move on, to put that night behind us, but it's like a dark cloud that hangs over us, a shadow that we can't escape. I've gone over everything that happened in my mind, trying to make sense of it, but nothing adds up. The road we took, the town we found, the liquor store, it all seems like a bad dream, a nightmare that we can't wake up from. And I know that whatever we encountered that night, it's not done with us. It's still out there, lurking around the bend, waiting for us to make another wrong turn. The road trip was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to escape the routine of our lives. But instead it led us into a nightmare, a place where the lines between reality and horror blurred, where the past and the present collided in a way that we couldn't understand.